His phone vibrated against the marble table, Precious' face flashing on the screen, their daughter Anita clutched in her tired arms. In-han didn't even glance at it. He swiped it away like discarding trash and leaned back in his leather chair, adjusting his tailored cuffs with casual indifference. That single motion would destroy everything he'd ever built. Because In-han wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was Seoul's invisible king, the most feared Korean underworld boss in the city. And tonight, as rain drummed against his penthouse windows, he believed he'd already won at life. What he didn't know was that his empire was about to collapse. And the woman he'd ignored would be the one holding the match. Stay until the end, because this story proves that sometimes the quietest revenge is the most devastating. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. It's a humid evening in downtown Seoul, 2021. The Azure Dragon, In-han's private establishment, hummed with the particular energy that came when dangerous men gathered to discuss dangerous business. This wasn't a restaurant open to the public. This was where Seoul's underworld elite conducted their most sensitive negotiations over aged whiskey and carefully prepared delicacies. The rules were absolute: speak in code, trust no one completely, and never show weakness. In-han sat at the head of his usual table, a commanding presence even in stillness. At 38, he'd built a criminal empire that controlled everything from shipping routes to political influence, from luxury developments to the night economy that powered Seoul's hidden wealth. His tailored black suit cost more than most people earned in months. His watch, a custom piece, was worth more than a luxury car. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as dangerous, dark, calculating, missing nothing. Tonight, like every Thursday for the past 6 years, he was conducting strategy with his most trusted lieutenants. The conversation flowed in measured tones, territory expansions discussed, rival organizations assessed, profit margins analyzed with surgical precision. This was how In-han operated. Methodical. Calculated. Emotion locked away where it couldn't interfere with business. He'd survived in this world by understanding one fundamental truth: attachment was weakness. Care about something, and your enemies would use it against you. Show vulnerability, and the wolves would circle. So In-han had built walls. High ones. Impenetrable ones. Or so he thought. But walls built to keep enemies out also trap you inside. And In-han was about to discover that the greatest threat to his empire wasn't a rival gang or police investigation. It was the family he'd abandoned. The phone vibrated again. Precious. Again. In-han's jaw tightened with annoyance. Woo Jin, his most loyal lieutenant, glanced at the phone and then away quickly, knowing better than to comment on his boss's personal life. But the calls kept coming. 3 times in the past hour. Each one ignored. Each one adding another brick to a wall that was about to come crashing down. In-han didn't know that Precious wasn't calling to beg or complain. She was calling to give him one final chance. One last opportunity to choose his family over his empire. He didn't know that their daughter Anita was clutching a crayon drawing she'd made, 3 figures holding hands under a bright sun, labeled Daddy, Mommy, Me, in careful letters. He didn't know that this would be Precious' last attempt to reach the man she'd married instead of the monster he'd become. Most importantly, In-han didn't know that Precious had been protecting him all these years. That her late father's connections and her own discretion had kept authorities from connecting certain financial trails. That her silence had been a gift he'd never appreciated. That gift was about to be revoked. Because In-han had made a choice. And that choice had a name: Seo-yun. You see, In-han hadn't always been this cold. 5 years earlier, he'd been different. 5 years earlier, In-han had met Precious in Tokyo during what should have been a routine business trip. He'd been sitting alone in a hotel lounge, reviewing acquisition documents for a shipping company he was taking over, through methods the company's board would never willingly agree to. His reputation preceded him even in Japan. Other guests kept their distance. Staff served him with efficient fear. Then she'd sat down at the piano in the corner. Precious played without showmanship or pretense, her fingers moving across the keys with quiet confidence. The melody was something classical, Debussy, perhaps, soft and melancholic in a way that made In-han pause mid-sentence in his phone conversation. When she finished, she'd looked directly at him and smiled. Not the nervous smile people gave him when they recognized danger. Not the calculated smile of those seeking favor or opportunity. Just a genuine smile, as if he were simply another person in a hotel lounge. "You looked like you needed something beautiful," she'd said in perfect Korean, though her features suggested mixed heritage. "The music helps me think. I hope it didn't disturb you." In-han had been so startled by her casual tone that he'd actually answered honestly. "It didn't disturb me. It helped." That conversation became dinner. Dinner became 3 days of unexpected companionship. Precious spoke to him about art, philosophy, her work in international charity foundations, treating him like a human being, not a criminal legend. She knew what he was. She'd done her research the moment she learned his name. But unlike others who either feared him or wanted to use him, Precious seemed curious about the person beneath the reputation. "You don't have to be what people expect," she told him on their last evening together. "You can choose differently." In-han had laughed at the naivety. "You don't understand my world." "Maybe not," Precious had replied. "But I understand loneliness when I see it." Against all logic, against the advice of Woo Jin and every survival instinct he'd honed over years in the underworld, In-han pursued her. For 6 months, he traveled to meet her. In Tokyo. In Singapore. In quiet European cities where no one knew his name and he could pretend to be ordinary. Precious never asked about his business. Never judged his choices. But she also never pretended he was someone he wasn't. "I see you, In-han," she'd said one night in Paris, rain pattering against their hotel window. "The man you were. The man you could still be. But I also see what you've become. And I need you to know, I'm choosing to love all of it. Even the parts that scare me." They married quietly in a private ceremony. No gang affiliations. No political theater. Just two people making impossible promises in a world that didn't believe in such things. When Precious became pregnant, something shifted in In-han's carefully constructed universe. Anita was born on a spring morning, arriving 3 weeks early as if impatient to meet the world. "Hello friends, you've watched this far, don't be one of those people who enjoy and disappear. Subscribe, like, and let me know where you're watching from. This channel survives because of people like you, so please subscribe, like, and join the family. I truly appreciate every single one of you. Let's continue our amazing story." In-han had been in a strategy meeting when Woo Jin interrupted with the news. He'd abandoned everything, documents scattered, lieutenants confused, and rushed to the hospital with an urgency he'd never shown for business. When the nurse placed Anita in his arms for the first time, In-han felt something crack open in his chest. She was impossibly small. Fragile. Perfect. Her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, gripping with surprising strength, and In-han made a silent promise: "This child will never know the hunger I knew. Never feel the powerlessness I felt. Never be vulnerable the way I was." For 3 months, he kept that promise in ways that surprised everyone. In-han came home early. He held Anita for hours, watching her sleep, marveling at every expression that crossed her infant face. He listened when Precious talked about building a real family, about maybe stepping back from the most dangerous aspects of his empire. He laughed again, really laughed, for the first time in years. Woo Jin noticed the change. "Boss, you seem lighter." In-han had smiled, Anita asleep against his shoulder. "Maybe I am." Precious dreamed during those months. She imagined a future where In-han's wealth came from legitimate businesses. Where Anita could grow up without bodyguards. Where family dinners didn't get interrupted by coded phone calls about territory disputes. She never asked him to abandon everything overnight. Just to start choosing them more often than he chose power. And for those brief, shining months, it seemed possible. But power is addictive in ways love never is. As Anita grew from infant to toddler, Inhan's criminal network expanded into new territories. Opportunities emerged that required his personal attention. Rivals tested boundaries that demanded immediate response. The late nights returned. First occasionally. Then regularly. Then constantly. Just this one deal, Inhan would say, kissing Precious goodbye at 7 p.m. and returning at 3 a.m. Just this one meeting, he'd promise, missing Anita's first steps because a territorial dispute required his presence. Just this one crisis, he'd explain, choosing a weapons negotiation over their daughter's second birthday party. Each choice seemed justified in isolation. Business was business. The empire required maintenance. His absence was temporary, necessary, unavoidable. But promises aren't broken in single dramatic moments. They erode one missed dinner at a time. Precious watched it happen with growing sadness. She'd rock Anita to sleep alone, singing lullabies to a daughter who'd started asking, "Where's Daddy?" She never screamed. Never issued ultimatums. She only asked one question, repeated in variations over months. "Do we still matter to you?" Inhan never answered directly. He'd gesture at their luxury penthouse, at Anita's designer clothes, at the bank accounts that ensured they'd never want for anything material. As if money could substitute for presence. As if wealth could replace time. As if power could fill the absence where love should be. Then Seo Yun entered his life at a high-level networking event. She was beautiful in the calculated way that came from professional styling and strategic presentation. Ambitious. Sharp. Utterly captivated by Inhan's power and influence. She asked about his empire, not his family. Admired his ruthlessness, not his humanity. Made him feel like the dangerous, untouchable king he'd worked so hard to become. With Precious, Inhan was reminded of the ordinary man he'd been. The vulnerable person beneath the reputation. With Seo Yun, he was only the legend. And that felt intoxicating. The affair started as most do, with small betrayals that seemed harmless at first. A dinner that ran too late. A business trip that didn't require overnight stays but took them anyway. Meetings that could have been emails but became excuses. Soon, Inhan stopped sleeping at home entirely. He told himself it was temporary. Complicated. Something he'd resolve eventually. But eventually never came. And Precious, sitting alone in their penthouse with Anita asleep in her lap, stopped asking if they still mattered. She already knew the answer. Seo Yun understood men like Inhan in ways Precious never could, or never wanted to. She didn't see a husband who needed to come home to his family. She saw an emperor who deserved worship. And she gave it to him generously, strategically, addictively. "You're brilliant," she'd whisper during late-night strategy sessions that had nothing to do with business. "The way you handled that negotiation, ruthless. Everyone fears you, and they should." Precious had once told Inhan he didn't have to be what people expected. Seo Yun told him he should be exactly what they feared. The difference was intoxicating. She appeared at every high-level function where Seoul's elite gathered, always positioned where Inhan would notice her, always dressed to command attention, always ready with observations that fed his ego like oxygen to flame. "Most men play at power," she'd said at a charity gala, champagne glass tilted elegantly. "You actually own it. There's a difference. Everyone here knows it." Inhan had smiled, feeling the validation settle warm in his chest. This was what he'd built himself to be. Not a gentle father rocking a toddler to sleep. Not a husband trying to balance legitimate business with criminal empire. But a force of nature that bent the world to his will. With Seo Yun, he didn't have to pretend to be softer than he was. With her, his ruthlessness wasn't something to apologize for, it was something to celebrate. The affair progressed with the inevitability of a slow-motion catastrophe. Dinner meetings stretched past midnight. Business trips required luxury hotel suites that Precious was never invited to. Phone calls were answered immediately when Seo Yun's name flashed across the screen, the same calls that went to voicemail when Precious tried to reach him. Wu Jin noticed but said nothing. Loyalty meant accepting your boss's choices, even when those choices carved visible wounds. In Han's calendar told the story his words wouldn't. Anita's third birthday marked unavailable. His wedding anniversary blocked out 4 critical negotiations that happened to include Seo-yun. Precious's doctor appointments for her regular checkups, completely forgotten. He missed the morning Anita learned to write her name. The afternoon she fell and needed stitches. The evening she asked Precious why Daddy didn't love them anymore. These moments happened in the margins of Han's consciousness, acknowledged briefly through text messages before being buried under more pressing concerns: territory expansion, profit optimization, reputation management. Seo-yun made it easy to forget. She never asked about his family. Never reminded him of responsibilities that existed outside their bubble of mutual admiration and physical gratification. She was the escape he'd convinced himself he deserved. At home, the penthouse that had once felt like a sanctuary, Precious developed a routine born of resignation. 7 p.m., check phone. No message. 9 p.m., put Anita to bed alone, making excuses about Daddy's important work. 11 p.m., sit on the couch in darkness, watching city lights blur through windows, wondering when exactly she'd become invisible. 2 a.m., hear the door open occasionally, Han retrieving clothes or documents, moving through their home like a hotel he was checking out of permanently. Anita stopped asking where Daddy was. Children adapt quickly to absence. She simply accepted that other kids had fathers who came to park visits and bedtime stories, and she had a daddy who existed in photographs and brief, distracted phone calls. One night, Precious finally asked the question she'd been avoiding. Han had come home at midnight, smelling of expensive perfume that wasn't hers. He was gathering files from his office, preparing to leave again. "Do we still matter to you?" Precious asked from the doorway, her voice barely above a whisper. Han didn't even turn around. "I provide everything you need." "That's not what I asked." He paused, hand on a folder, but didn't face her. "I'm building something bigger than your family," Precious finished quietly. "Bigger than your daughter who drew you a picture yesterday and cried when I said you were too busy to see it?" Silence stretched between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross anymore. "I have responsibilities," Han said finally, his tone clipped, defensive. "So do I," Precious replied. "But I'm here. Every night. Every milestone. Every moment she needs a parent." She paused. "Where are you, Han?" He should have answered. Should have looked at his wife, this woman who'd chosen him despite knowing what he was, who'd protected his secrets, who'd given him a daughter that reminded him he was human. Instead, Han grabbed his files and walked toward the door. "I'll send more money for Anita's education fund," he said. As if money could substitute for presence. As if wealth could heal the wound of abandonment. Precious watched him leave, her hand resting gently on her stomach, on the secret she'd been preparing to share, the news of a second child growing inside her. But Han was already gone, the elevator doors closing on whatever remained of their marriage. She stood alone in the penthouse that felt more like a museum of abandoned dreams than a home. Through the window, she could see Seoul's glittering skyline, the city her husband ruled from shadows. He owned everything out there. But he'd lost everything in here. And the saddest part was that Han didn't even realize it yet. He was too busy building an empire to notice he'd already destroyed a kingdom. Precious wiped tears she refused to let fall and walked to Anita's room, where their daughter slept peacefully, unaware that her family was fracturing beyond repair. "Do we still matter?" she whispered to the empty apartment. The silence answered for him. Sunday evening settled over Seoul with deceptive peace. Precious had spent the afternoon preparing Han's favorite meal, galbi-jjim, braised short ribs that required hours of patient cooking. The recipe had been his mother's, shared during their brief courtship when Han had still talked about his childhood, about the poverty that had shaped him, about the dreams he'd once had beyond power and fear. The dining table was set with care. Candles flickered despite the early hour. The apartment smelled of slow-cooked meat, garlic, and desperate hope. Anita sat by the door, legs folded beneath her, clutching a drawing she'd worked on all week. 3 figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun, Daddy, Mommy, and herself rendered in careful crayon strokes. She'd written, "Our family," across the top in wobbly letters she'd practiced repeatedly. "When's Daddy coming?" Anita asked for the 7th time. "Soon, baby," Precious lied gently, checking her phone again. She'd sent Han a message that morning, "Please come home tonight. It's important. We need to talk." He'd read it. The blue checkmarks confirmed it. But he hadn't replied. Still, Precious waited. Because she had news that might change everything. News that might remind Han what family meant, what they'd once promised each other. She was pregnant. 8 weeks. Another child. Another chance. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the catalyst that brought him back. At 7:30 p.m., headlights swept across the living room windows. "Daddy." Anita jumped up, drawing clutched tight, running to the door. Precious stood slowly, smoothing her dress, practicing the words she'd rehearsed. "We're having another baby. Come home. Please, choose us." The elevator doors opened. Han stepped out first, his tailored suit perfect, his expression unreadable. Then Seo-Yun emerged behind him, her hand possessively on his arm, her designer dress and confident smile declaring ownership. Precious felt the world tilt sideways. The apartment hallway wasn't private. Mrs. Park from 3B was collecting her mail. The Kim family's teenage son was heading out with friends. Old Mr. Choi was walking his small dog. Everyone saw. Everyone stopped. Everyone watched as Korea's most feared underworld boss brought his mistress to his family's doorstep. In Han, Precious's voice came out smaller than she intended. Anita stood frozen halfway between her parents, drawing trembling in her small hands, confusion clouding her face. "Daddy? Who is that?" Han looked at his wife, really looked at her, for the first time in months. He saw the carefully prepared meal through the open door. The candles. The hope written across Precious's face. And he chose cruelty over courage. "This is Seo-Yun," Han said flatly, his voice carrying through the hallway. "This is who I love now." The words landed like physical blows. Mrs. Park gasped audibly. The Kim boy pulled out his phone. This would be neighborhood gossip within the hour. Precious's hand instinctively moved to her stomach, to the secret growing there, to the child who would never know their father wanted them. "You and the child can move out," Han continued, each word delivered with businesslike efficiency. "I'll arrange a place. I'll send money for expenses. But I'm done pretending." "Pretending," Precious whispered. "We're your family." "You were convenient," Han said, and Seo-Yun smiled beside him. "I married you when I needed stability. Now I need something else." Anita's drawing slipped from her fingers, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. "Daddy?" Her voice was so small, so confused. She didn't understand the adult cruelty unfolding, only that something was terribly wrong. She ran forward and grabbed Han's leg with both arms, her face pressed against his expensive trousers. "Daddy, don't go. I made you a picture. We're having dinner. Mommy made your favorite." Han looked down at his daughter, this 3-year-old child who'd done nothing except love him unconditionally, who'd waited by doors for a father who never came, who'd drawn family portraits of people who barely existed together anymore. He should have knelt down. Should have held her. Should have remembered the promise he'd made in a hospital room when she was born, "You'll never feel powerless like I did." Instead, Han gently but firmly removed Anita's hands from his leg. "Let go," he said quietly. "Please, Daddy." "I said let go." He stepped back, and Anita stumbled slightly, her small hands reaching for him, tears starting to fall. Seo-Yun watched with barely concealed satisfaction. Precious stood paralyzed in the doorway, watching her husband, the man who'd once promised to be different, to choose love over power, destroy their daughter's world with calculated precision. Han turned without another word and pressed the elevator button. Wait, Precious found her voice. In Han, But the elevator doors opened, and he stepped inside with Seo Yun, cutting off whatever Precious had been about to say. The last thing they saw before the doors closed was in Han's face, completely blank, as if he'd just concluded a business transaction instead of demolishing his family. Anita's drawing lay crumpled on the hallway floor. The neighbors scattered quickly, uncomfortable witnesses to a private catastrophe. Precious slowly knelt and picked up the drawing, the crayon sun already smudged, the three connected figures now seeming like a cruel joke. Anita stood crying silently, the kind of tears that came when a child's world stopped making sense. "Mommy," she whispered. "Why doesn't Daddy love us anymore?" Precious had no answer. She pulled Anita close, holding her daughter while the galbi gym grew cold on the table and the candles burned down to nothing. Inside the apartment, everything looked the same, the carefully set table, the warm lighting, the home she'd tried to build. But something fundamental had shattered. This was the moment in Han's fate was sealed. Not by rivals or police or business failures, but by the hands of a 3-year-old daughter he'd gently pushed away. By the wife he'd humiliated in front of witnesses. By the choice to value ego over humanity. The empire he'd built with ruthlessness was about to learn a hard truth. The most dangerous enemy isn't the one you see coming. It's the one you've already betrayed. The apartment was silent except for the soft sound of a suitcase zipper closing. Precious moved through rooms she'd once called home with methodical calm, selecting only what mattered: Anita's favorite stuffed rabbit, birth certificates, a small photo album, essential clothes. She left behind the designer wardrobe Han had bought her, the expensive jewelry, the luxury items that were supposed to substitute for presents. Material things had never been the point. Anita sat on the couch, still wearing her pajamas though it was nearly noon, her eyes red and swollen from crying herself to sleep the night before. She watched her mother pack with the quiet understanding children develop when their world has already broken. "Are we leaving, Daddy?" she asked softly. Precious knelt before her daughter, brushing hair from her tear-stained face. "We're going somewhere safe, baby. Somewhere we can be happy. Will Daddy come find us?" The question pierced Precious's heart. "I don't think Daddy wants to be found right now." She didn't cry. Tears required energy she needed for other things. Instead, Precious felt something else crystallizing inside her, not rage, not grief, but cold, absolute clarity. For 5 years, she had made herself small. Quiet. Accommodating. Not out of weakness, but out of choice. Because Precious knew something Han had never bothered to ask, who she really was before they met. Her father, Lee Jae-sung, had been one of Asia's most influential international businessmen before his death 3 years ago. His empire had spanned legitimate industries, manufacturing, technology, real estate, with connections reaching from Seoul to Singapore, Tokyo to London. When Precious had fallen in love with Han, her father had investigated thoroughly. He discovered exactly what kind of man his daughter was marrying, a criminal, yes, but one with ambition and intelligence. "If you love him, I'll accept your choice," Lee Jae-sung had told Precious privately. "But I'm giving you something, daughter. Insurance." He provided her with complete documentation of how Han's money moved. The offshore accounts. The shell companies. The intricate financial architecture that kept his criminal empire from legal scrutiny. "If he ever becomes a danger to you or your children," her father had said, "you'll have the power to protect yourself. Not with violence. With truth." Precious had never told Han about these files. She'd kept them locked away, hoping she'd never need them, believing that love and patience could transform him. She'd protected him by staying silent. By using her father's connections to quietly redirect investigations that got too close. By ensuring certain financial trails remained invisible to authorities. Han had built his empire believing he was untouchable. He never realized the only reason he'd stayed untouchable was because Precious had been touching the scales. Now, in a modest hotel room across the city, Precious sat at a desk while Anita napped in the bedroom. She opened her laptop and accessed files she'd hoped never to use. Account numbers. Transaction records. Shell company structures. Connections between legitimate businesses and criminal operations. Everything documented with the precision her father had taught her. Her phone sat beside the laptop, a single contact already pulled up, James Morrison, her father's former attorney, now based in London and specializing in international financial law. Precious stared at the phone for a long moment. This call would change everything. Would destroy Inhan's carefully constructed empire. Would expose him to legal consequences he'd spent years avoiding. But he'd made his choice. In front of neighbors. In front of their daughter. With casual cruelty that revealed exactly how little they'd ever mattered. She thought about the child growing inside her, 8 weeks of cells that would become a person who deserved better than a father who valued power over family. She thought about Anita, who'd cried herself to sleep asking why Daddy didn't love them anymore. She thought about the years she'd spent waiting, hoping, believing in a man who'd chosen ego over humanity. Precious picked up the phone and dialed. James? It's Precious Lee. I need you to activate Protocol 7. There was a pause. James had been waiting for this call since her father's death, hoping it would never come. Are you certain? He asked gently. Once we start this, there's no stopping it. Precious looked at Anita sleeping peacefully, finally calm after hours of confusion and tears. I'm certain, she said. Begin the process. Freeze the offshore accounts first. Then contact the international banking authorities. I'm sending you everything. This will destroy him financially, James warned. He destroyed us first, Precious replied quietly. I'm just making sure he can't hurt anyone else. She ended the call and began uploading files. Years of protection, reversed in minutes. Shields removed. Secrets exposed. Not out of vengeance, Precious wasn't built for revenge. But out of protection. For her children. For herself. For every other person Inhan would hurt if left unchecked. 2 weeks passed. Inhan lived in luxury with Seo Yun, convinced he'd successfully escaped emotional baggage. He conducted business as usual, expanded operations, celebrated deals with expensive whiskey. He never called to check on Anita. Never asked if Precious had found a place to stay. Never wondered why she'd left so quietly, without lawyers or demands or the messy confrontation he'd expected. Inhan's arrogance had become so complete that he never questioned the silence. Never suspected that silence was preparation. Never realized that the gentlest person in his life had been holding the keys to his kingdom all along. And she'd just locked all the doors. The penthouse suite overlooked Seoul's glittering skyline like a throne room suspended in glass and steel. Inhan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, whiskey in hand, Seo Yun draped elegantly on the leather sofa behind him. Everything in this space spoke of victory, imported Italian furniture, original artwork worth more than most homes, a view that made him feel like he owned the city spread beneath him. You seem lighter, Seo Yun observed, scrolling through her phone. Like a weight's been lifted. Inhan smiled. I finally stopped pretending to be something I'm not. No more playing house. No more guilt about missed dinners or disappointed looks. Family is overrated, Seo Yun said, standing to refill her wine. Especially when you're building an empire. People like us, we're meant for bigger things than domestic mediocrity. Inhan raised his glass in agreement. 2 weeks since he'd walked away from Precious and Anita, and he felt free. Unburdened. Like he'd finally shed dead weight that had been slowing his ascent. He'd sent money to an account he'd set up for them. His obligation fulfilled. Clean. Simple. Transactional. No messy emotions. No complications. Just pure, uncomplicated power. His phone rang. Wu Jin's name flashed across the screen, unusual for this late in the evening. Inhan answered casually, expecting a routine update. Boss. Wu Jin's voice carried something Inhan had never heard from his most loyal lieutenant, panic. We have a serious problem. Inhan's smile faded. Define serious. The accounts are frozen. All of them. Silence. What do you mean, all of them? In-han said slowly, setting down his whiskey. Singapore. Cayman Islands. Switzerland. Every offshore account just locked simultaneously. I tried accessing emergency reserves, nothing. It's like someone flipped a master switch. In-han's mind raced through possibilities. Technical glitch. Banking error. Maybe a rival had somehow. There's more, Wu Jin continued, his voice trembling now. International banking authorities flagged suspicious transfers. Multiple jurisdictions. They have. Boss, they have everything. Transaction records. Shell company structures. Connections we spent years hiding. Someone leaked our entire financial architecture. The room tilted slightly. That's impossible, In-han said, but his voice lacked conviction. Those records are scattered, encrypted, protected, Wu Jin finished. I know. But someone had access to all of it. Someone who understood the whole system. In-han's blood turned to ice. Precious. But that was impossible. She didn't know about. Except she did. Her father. Lee Jae-sung's connections. The quiet way she'd always handled their legitimate business fronts. The financial documents she'd occasionally reviewed to help organize taxes. She'd been watching all along. Protecting him. Until she stopped. How bad? In-han asked. Catastrophic, Wu Jin replied. Authorities are moving tonight. I'm hearing coordinated raids across. Explosions of sound erupted in the background of Wu Jin's call. Shouting. Crashes. They're here, Wu Jin whispered. Boss, there. The line went dead. Over the next 6 hours, In-han watched his empire disintegrate in real time. Warehouses raided simultaneously across 3 districts. Properties seized with surgical precision. Authorities knew exactly which buildings mattered, which were fronts, which held actual operations. His shipping routes blocked by international cooperation he didn't know was possible. Bank accounts not just frozen but already under forensic investigation. Loyal lieutenants arrested before they could run. Associates who owed him favors suddenly unreachable, their phones disconnected, their loyalty evaporating the moment his power wavered. Rival organizations sensed blood in the water immediately. By dawn, they were moving on territories In-han had held for years, absorbing his operations, recruiting his former soldiers who saw no future in a sinking ship. Wu Jin managed one final text before his phone went dark. I'm sorry, boss. They have everything. I can't help you. In-han made call after call, to judges he'd bribed, politicians he'd funded, business partners who'd profited from his protection. Every single one went to voicemail. By morning, the man who'd commanded Seoul's underworld couldn't get a taxi driver to accept his credit card. Seo-yeon watched it all unfold from the penthouse sofa, her expression shifting from concern to calculation with each new disaster. This is temporary, right? She asked, her voice careful. You have backup plans? In-han didn't answer. Couldn't answer. He was too busy watching decades of careful construction collapse in hours. In-han? Seo-yeon stood, gathering her designer purse. You have resources hidden somewhere, don't you? Money they can't touch? He finally looked at her, really looked at her, and saw what Precious must have seen from the beginning, someone attracted to power, not to the person wielding it. I need to make some calls, Seo-yeon said, already moving toward the door. My phone's dying. I'll be back soon. She kissed his cheek with practiced affection. And walked out. In-han knew, even before the elevator doors closed, that she wouldn't return. 48 hours later, In-han stood alone in the penthouse that no longer belonged to him. Eviction notices were already posted. Assets frozen pending investigation. The luxury apartment that had felt like a throne now felt like a museum exhibit, the arrogance of fallen kings. His phone, the one that used to ring constantly with subordinates seeking orders, sat silent on the marble counter. Seo Yun had blocked his number. Her social media already showed her at exclusive parties, laughing with other powerful men, as if Han had never existed. The whiskey he'd been drinking to celebrate freedom 2 days ago now mocked him from the bar. Han walked to the window one last time, looking out at the city he'd once believed he controlled. Somewhere out there, Precious was with Anita. Safe. Protected by the same connections that had just destroyed him. He'd had everything. A wife who loved him. A daughter who adored him. A family that made him human. And he'd traded it all for this, an empty penthouse, frozen accounts, and the crushing realization that power built on fear dissolves the moment that fear disappears. Han's phone buzzed, a final notification before service would be disconnected for non-payment. A news alert, major organized crime network dismantled through international cooperation. Authorities credit anonymous tip with unprecedented detail. Anonymous. But Han knew exactly who'd made that call. The gentlest person he'd ever known had become the architect of his destruction. Not through violence. Through truth. It took Han 3 days to find them. 3 days of calling in the last favors anyone owed him. 3 days of wearing the same clothes because his closets had been sealed by authorities. 3 days of learning what powerlessness actually felt like. The address led him to a modest neighborhood in Mapo, nothing like the luxury districts he was accustomed to. The building was clean but ordinary, with small balconies where residents hung laundry and grew potted plants. Children's bicycles cluttered the entrance. Normal people living normal lives. Han stood across the street for 20 minutes, gathering courage he didn't know he'd need. Through a third-floor window, he could see movement. And then he saw her. Anita. His daughter sat on the floor surrounded by building blocks, constructing a tower with intense concentration. When it toppled, she laughed, genuinely laughed, the sound muffled by glass but unmistakable. She looked happy. Happier than Han remembered seeing her in their luxury penthouse where she'd had every toy imaginable but a father who was never there. Precious appeared in the window, carrying 2 cups of what looked like hot chocolate. She sat beside Anita on the floor, helping rebuild the tower, smiling at something their daughter said. The scene was so simple. So peaceful. So completely devoid of him. Han felt something crack in his chest, not the dramatic shattering he'd expected, but a slow, terrible fracturing. Like ice breaking under weight it was never meant to carry. He crossed the street and pressed the buzzer. When Precious opened the door, her expression didn't change. No surprise. No anger. Just a calm, terrible knowing, as if she'd been expecting this moment. Han, she said quietly. Can we talk? His voice sounded foreign to his own ears. Small. Desperate. Precious glanced back toward the apartment where Anita was still playing. 5 minutes. In the hallway. She stepped out and closed the door behind her, creating a barrier between her family and the man who'd destroyed it. Han had rehearsed speeches during the journey here. Explanations. Justifications. Ways to make her understand that he'd been under pressure, that business had demanded sacrifices, that he'd never meant. Instead, he dropped to his knees. Right there in the modest hallway with its worn carpet and flickering overhead light, Korea's once feared underworld boss knelt before the wife he'd humiliated. I lost everything, he whispered, the words scraping his throat. The accounts, the properties, the business, it's all gone. Precious, I need help. Please. I know I made mistakes, but... Mistakes, Precious's voice remained eerily calm. You think what you did were mistakes? I can fix this. If you could make a call, use your father's connections to save you, Precious finished. The way I saved you for 5 years without you ever knowing? The way I protected your empire while you ignored our daughter's birthdays? Han looked up at her, confusion breaking through desperation. You knew? I knew everything, Han, every account. Every shell company. Every illegal transaction you thought was untouchable. Precious crouched down to meet his eyes, and he saw something in her gaze he'd never seen before: steel. My father gave me insurance. Documentation. Power. And I used it to protect you because I loved you. Because I believed you'd choose us eventually. Then help me now. You lost us long before you lost your money, Precious said, each word landing with quiet devastation. You lost us the first night you chose her over Anita's bedtime. You lost us when you stopped answering my calls. You lost us the moment you removed our daughter's hands from your leg and walked away. In Han's throat tightened. I made bad choices. I know. But I can change. I can be better. Please, for Anita. The apartment door opened. Anita stood in the doorway, her small frame backlit by the warm interior light. She held something in her hands, the drawing from that terrible Sunday night, now wrinkled and torn. She walked past Precious and stopped in front of Inhan, studying him with eyes too old for a 3-year-old. Hi, Daddy, she said softly. Hi, baby girl, Inhan's voice broke. I missed you. Anita didn't respond. Instead, she placed the drawing on the floor between them, the crayon family now barely visible through creases and smudges. The bright sun at the top had been partially ripped, splitting the circle in half. You broke our sun, Daddy, Anita said, her small voice carrying a truth adults spend lifetimes avoiding. Inhan stared at the ruined drawing, at the family he'd rendered in pieces, at the symbolic destruction his own daughter recognized even if she couldn't articulate why. I'm sorry, he whispered, tears finally breaking free. I'm so sorry. Anita looked at him with something that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite condemnation, just honest observation from someone too young to hide behind pretense. Mommy says sorry is what you say when you step on someone's toe. But you stepped on our whole heart. She paused. That's bigger than sorry. Precious gently guided Anita back inside, but the little girl turned one more time. Are you going to fix the sun? She asked. Inhan had no answer. Because he finally understood what his daughter was really asking. Are you going to become the person we needed you to be? Or are you just sorry you got caught? The door closed softly. Inhan remained kneeling in the hallway, the broken drawing at his feet, the weight of his choices crushing down with a force no rival had ever managed. He'd built an empire through ruthlessness. And lost a kingdom through neglect. The math was simple, brutal, and completely irreversible. He'd been dethroned not by enemies, but by his own hand. And unlike business failures, this kind of bankruptcy couldn't be restructured. Some things, once broken, stay broken. Some suns, once shattered, don't shine again. 6 months had passed since Inhan's empire collapsed, and Seoul had already forgotten him. The man who once commanded fear with a glance now stood in a construction site queue at 5:30 a.m., waiting for the foreman to assign day labor. His tailored suits had been replaced by worn work clothes purchased from a discount store. His expensive watch, sold weeks ago for rent money. You, new guy, the foreman called, not bothering to learn Inhan's name. Rebar loading. 12 hours. Cash at the end if you don't quit. Inhan nodded and followed the other workers, immigrants, men with criminal records, those whom society had rendered invisible. He was one of them now. His hands, once accustomed to signing contracts worth millions, now blistered from carrying steel rods in summer heat. His back ached from labor his body had never been conditioned for. By day's end, he could barely straighten his spine. The tiny studio apartment he rented in Gurion, Seoul's last remaining shantytown, cost more than he could afford on construction wages. No furniture except a sleeping mat. No air conditioning. Shared bathroom down the hall. Former associates who saw him on the street looked away quickly, embarrassed by proximity to failure. Rivals who once feared him now laughed openly at his downfall. The invisible king had become actually invisible. And for the first time in his adult life, Inhan understood what poverty truly meant, not just financial scarcity, but the complete erasure of dignity, choice, and voice. Meanwhile, across the city, Precious had transformed grief into purpose. Using her father's legitimate business connections and her own inherited resources, she'd established the Lee Foundation, a charity supporting immigrant families, single mothers, and disadvantaged children throughout Seoul. The foundation's headquarters occupied a renovated building in Itaewon, its walls covered with children's artwork and photographs of families helped back to stability. Precious worked there daily, reviewing cases, meeting families, ensuring resources reached those who needed them most. Anita had become the foundation's heart, the small girl who greeted everyone with genuine warmth, who played with children from backgrounds her father would have once exploited, who demonstrated kindness as naturally as breathing. Local media occasionally featured the foundation's work, always highlighting Precious's grace and Anita's compassion. The stories never mentioned in Han, it was as if he'd been edited from their narrative completely. Which, in most ways that mattered, he had been. Precious had moved on. Not through bitterness or revenge, those emotions required energy better spent elsewhere, but through intentional creation of something meaningful from wreckage. She was rebuilding too. Just in the opposite direction from her former husband. Upward instead of downward. Toward light instead of shadow. The rain started suddenly one October evening, the kind of downpour that sent people running for shelter. Han stood outside the Lee Foundation building, soaked through, having walked 40 minutes from his construction site because he couldn't afford subway fare. He wasn't there to ask for help. He wasn't there to make demands. He was there because he'd finally learned the difference between apology and accountability. Precious emerged from the building under an umbrella, preparing to drive home. She saw him immediately, impossible to miss, standing alone in the rain like a ghost from a life she'd left behind. She could have ignored him. Driven past. Let security escort him away. Instead, she walked toward him. Han, she said quietly. I'm not here to ask for anything, he said quickly, water streaming down his face. I needed you to know something. Precious waited, umbrella tilted slightly to shield them both. You were right. About everything, Han's voice was raw, stripped of the arrogance that had once defined him. I didn't lose you when the money disappeared. I lost you years before. Every missed birthday. Every ignored call. Every time I chose ego over humanity. He pulled something from his pocket, Anita's broken drawing, now protected in a plastic sleeve, carried with him everywhere. I keep this to remember what I destroyed. Not the empire. Not the wealth. This. The son she drew. The family I had and didn't value until it was gone. Precious's expression remained unreadable. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Han continued. I don't deserve it. I'm not asking to come back, I know that bridge is burned. I just wanted to apologize. Sincerely. Without excuses. Without expecting anything in return. He bowed deeply, the formal bow of true contrition, holding the position far longer than necessary. When he straightened, Precious studied his face. The expensive arrogance had been replaced by something hard-earned, humility. The kind that came from genuine suffering rather than performed regret. Do you know what Anita asked me last week? Precious said softly. Han shook his head. She asked if you were okay. If you had food. If anyone was taking care of you. Precious's eyes glistened. Despite everything you did, she still worries about her father. Han's throat tightened. I can't give you our family back, Precious said. That's not mine to give anymore. You destroyed it, and some things can't be rebuilt the same way twice. I know. But. Precious paused, considering. You can see Anita. Supervised. At the foundation. Saturday afternoons. If you're consistent. If you're sober. If you put her needs before your pride. Hope flickered in Han's chest, not the arrogant certainty he'd once mistaken for confidence, but something fragile and precious. I'll be there, he promised. Every Saturday. I swear. Don't swear, Precious said. Just show up. Consistently. That's all she needs from you now. Not promises. Presents. She turned to leave, then looked back one more time. The man I married believed he had to be ruthless to survive. Maybe losing everything will teach you that the opposite is true. That real strength is showing up for a 3-year-old who still draws pictures with your name on them. Precious walked to her car, leaving Han standing in the rain with the first real chance at redemption he'd been given. Not handed to him. Earned through months of suffering and the beginning of genuine change. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was hope. And for a man who'd lost everything, hope was oxygen. The first Saturday, Anita wouldn't look at him. Han sat on the floor of the Lee Foundation's children's play area, surrounded by building blocks and toy towers, while his daughter kept a careful 3 feet of distance between them. A Foundation volunteer watched from the corner, supervision, as Precious had stipulated. Do you want to build something together? Han asked, his voice uncertain in ways it had never been during business negotiations. Anita shook her head, focusing intently on her own tower. 45 minutes passed in near silence. Han tried conversation, asking about school, about her favorite colors, about the drawings taped to the Foundation walls. Anita answered in monosyllables, polite but distant. When Precious came to collect her, Anita ran to her mother without looking back. Han left feeling like he'd failed a test he didn't know how to study for. But the next Saturday, he came back anyway. Week 2, Anita brought a puzzle to the table. Didn't ask Han to help. Just worked on it while he sat nearby, existing in her peripheral vision. Week 3, she asked him to hand her a specific puzzle piece. The blue one, she said. With the curve. Such a small request. Such monumental progress. Week 4, they built a tower together. When it fell, Anita didn't laugh like she used to. But she didn't cry either. She just started rebuilding, and Han helped without being asked. Week 8, she spoke full sentences. Mom says you work at construction now. Do you build big buildings? Smaller ones, Han admitted. I carry materials mostly. Help other people build. Oh. Anita considered this. That's helpful, I guess. I hope so. The volunteer in the corner smiled slightly. Progress looked different than people expected. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just a father and daughter learning to exist in the same space without everything shattering. Months accumulated like deposits in a different kind of account. Han never missed a Saturday. Not when he was sick with flu. Not when construction sites were desperately short-staffed and offered overtime. Not when his body ached so badly he could barely walk. Every Saturday at 2 p.m., he showed up. Consistent. Sober. Present. The city began whispering different stories about Han now. Not about his former power or spectacular fall, but about quiet transformation that didn't make headlines. Construction workers mentioned the guy who never complained, who worked harder than men half his age, who shared his lunch with immigrants who had less. Neighborhood shop owners noticed anonymous donations appearing at struggling businesses, small amounts, never traced, but consistent. The Lee Foundation received monthly contributions from an unmarked account. Not large sums. Just steady support from someone who understood what it meant to need help and receive none. Precious noticed but said nothing. She watched Han with Anita through the Foundation's office window, observing not grand gestures but accumulated small choices, patience when Anita ignored him, gentleness when she finally engaged, humility when she asked questions he didn't know how to answer. This wasn't the man who'd walked away from their daughter while she cried. This was someone different. Someone being rebuilt from foundation stones of actual character rather than ego and fear. 14 months after Han first knelt in Precious's hallway, a Sunday morning arrived with unusual warmth. Han had been given special permission for an extended visit. The foundation was hosting a community festival, and Anita had specifically asked if her father could come. He arrived early, helping set up tables and chairs, carrying supplies, making himself useful in ways that required no recognition. When the festival began, children flooded the courtyard. Anita appeared in a yellow dress, the same color as the one she'd worn that terrible night, though this one was new, unstained, hopeful. She saw In-han across the courtyard. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Father and daughter. Broken and healing. Separate but slowly, carefully, reconnecting. Then Anita did something that made In-han's breath catch. She ran toward him. Not frantically like that night when she'd grabbed his leg and begged him not to leave. But openly, choosing to close the distance, trusting that this time he wouldn't push her away. In-han knelt down, and Anita wrapped her small arms around his neck. "Hi, Daddy," she whispered. "Hi, baby girl," he managed, his voice breaking around the words. She didn't say she forgave him. Didn't declare everything fixed. Just hugged him, a simple gesture that meant she was willing to try. Willing to let him earn his way back into her life one Saturday at a time. Precious watched from the foundation entrance, one hand resting on her stomach where a second child grew, a baby In-han would meet someday, if he continued proving himself worthy of trust. She didn't smile, exactly. But something in her expression softened. Not forgiveness, perhaps. But acknowledgement that change, when genuine, deserved recognition. That evening, In-han sat on the roof of his tiny apartment building, looking out at Seoul's skyline. He'd once believed he owned this city. Had convinced himself that power came from fear, that success meant dominating others, that family was weakness to be managed or abandoned. The woman he'd chased, Seo-yun, had given him pleasure. Temporary validation. Ego inflation that evaporated the moment his power did. The family he'd abandoned, Precious and Anita, had offered him purpose. Meaning. The kind of wealth that couldn't be frozen by authorities or stolen by rivals. He'd lost everything material to finally understand what actually mattered. Not the empire. Not the reputation. Not the luxury or influence or fear. Just a 3-year-old girl who still drew pictures with his name on them, despite everything. Just the chance to be present instead of powerful. Just the opportunity to rebuild a son he'd shattered. In-han pulled Anita's drawing from his pocket, still carried everywhere, still protected, still his most valuable possession. The Crayon family held hands beneath a broken sun. But Anita had recently added something during one of their Saturdays together, a small piece of tape across the torn section, and a note in her careful handwriting. Fixing takes time. In-han smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time in what felt like years. He'd been Korea's most feared underworld boss, commanding respect through ruthlessness and violence. Now he was just a construction worker trying to earn his daughter's trust. And somehow, impossibly, the second role felt more powerful than the first. Because true strength wasn't dominating others. It was showing up. Consistently. Humbly. Hopefully. Even when, especially when, you'd already lost everything else. Before you go, if this story touched you even a little, don't leave without subscribing. It really helps this channel grow. Thank you.